Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, thank you for causing my life to flash before my eyes. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I've been looking forward to addressing a topic that I think is really very important and not well understood, and that is, what is skepticism good for? And I thought I would just tell you up front what it's good for. There are two main things, and hopefully as I go through my talk, you'll be able to follow that. There are two main things that skepticism is good for, and one is to undermine illegitimate claims to authority. And that has been historically one of the really vital things that skepticism has done, and we'll talk more about that. The second thing is it initiates inquiry. It stimulates inquiry. And given the human condition, a little stimulation in that respect is often very much needed. And I must say I'm a little bit worried about our campuses because I'm afraid the spirit of inquiry is not as strong as it should be and perhaps as it once was. So those are the two things now that skepticism is good for, and let me try to unfold all of this and help you think out that topic. And we're going to have questions in a little while, and if you have problems, the hard questions are the best ones, so be sure and write them down and you'll have a chance to work with them as we go along. Just a word about veritas. Veritas is a Latin word for truth, and everything sounds better in Latin. And in fact, if they had advertised a truth forum, probably a lot of people here wouldn't have come, right? Truth is scary on our campuses today, and there are good reasons for it. But on the other hand, it's really impossible to stay away from truth because it is so central to life. So let's begin by looking at a description of truth in our next slide. And we're not going to try to be philosophically too profound tonight. You can do that when we come to the questions. But basically, a thought or statement is true if what it is about is as that thought or statement represents it. Snow is white. That statement is true if snow is white, to use the hackneyed philosophical example. You have gas in your tank. That statement is true if you have gas in your tank. Right? Now, we can't split and start all the philosophical hairs on that, but this is a very simple thing, and truth itself is simple, very simple. Children pick it up quickly, and they pick up falsehood quickly. And they might not be able to give you a statement of it, but this is what they learn. You have promised to take them to Disneyland, all right? That is true if you take them to Disneyland. If not, it's, Daddy, Mommy, you said, and they understand very quickly what truth is. It's very simple. Children pick it up quickly. And however scary it may be, we really can't drop the word. It's just too central to life. We can't use the Latin word to help us out, and we have to still keep talking about truth. For many years, I served on the accreditation committees for WASC, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. And the very first standard in the WASC handbook says this: an institution of higher education is by definition dedicated to the search for truth and its dissemination. And the statement goes on to discuss that. It says, among other things, those within an educational institution have as the first concern knowledge, evidence, and truth. Now here's why I'm worried about this issue. You know, I served on I don't know how many site committees, and never once was there a discussion about truth. There was a discussion about how many books were in the library, how much time faculty spent with students, and so on, but never once a discussion about this central issue. See, truth has become an ominous topic, and we want to try to explain why that is. And partly it is because it is so important. Truth is so important because of its role in life. I like to use the figure of a sighting mechanism on a rocket or a gun. If the sighting mechanism is true, then if you use it well, you will hit the target. And truth in general is like that. Truth is what enables us to deal with things that are not right in front of our nose. We are able to sight them and deal with them without seeing them. Now, while truth is simple in its nature, truths are often exasperatingly complicated. And we have to have a way of dealing with truth that we can't make present to our senses or set before our mind. And that's where evidence and logic comes in. That's why it's so important. Logic enables us to ascertain truths which we cannot simply bring before us. And as it turns out, that's an awful lot of our truths. Tax time is coming up, and many of you will do your tax returns. And I guarantee you that most of what you put on those returns is not something that you can bring before your mind. But there is a method, and method is all important in dealing with truth. So truth is simple in itself, kind of threatening, absolutely important, and for example, on the campus, you're constantly dealing with it. Teachers and students and so on. Supposedly, when we grade papers, we're dealing with truth and knowledge in our students, and hopefully we have a little bit of that ourselves. So it's really important to understand why it's so important that we deal with truth. Veritas forum, truth forum, comes out of a situation where truth is in trouble, socially and on the campus. And it attempts to revive an interest and encourage the ability to deal with truth. Now, the next slide is the bitterness of truth, because truth is a bitter pill. It does not yield to what we want or our feelings. It's totally indifferent to human will and desire. And then you put that together with the fact that human desire and will is set on reshaping reality, and therefore truth, to suit itself. So now that's why lying and distortion are so common. And distortion is a large field that allows some people to avoid outright lying and yet to evade the truth. I recently had a book given to me on lying as second nature. Why is it so common? It's been observed you never have to teach a child to lie. They learn how to do it on their own. Why is it so common? Well, it's because reality is so hard to deal with. And people want to shift it and change it. And so lying becomes second nature. Advertising, for example, is one of the accepted forms of distortion and often outright lying. Why? Well, because someone wants to manipulate you and get you to do something that you otherwise might not do. They want you to do that. So there's the importance of truth and the bitterness of truth. Now, if we can have the next slide. truth doesn't do us much good without knowledge. And the connection between truth and knowledge and authority is really important for us to understand. So I put up here again a statement about knowledge. We have knowledge of something when we represent it as it is on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. Your beliefs can be true without you knowing that they're true. What have we got here? Here we are. Right. I knew it was there. So we have knowledge of something when we represent it as it is on an appropriate basis of thought and experience. And of course, that's why you're here at Claremont, is to gain knowledge. And that's what your professors grade you on, and you are ranked by whether or not you have gained knowledge. The real problem here is the phrase appropriate basis, and we have never succeeded in arriving at a general criterion for appropriate basis. And that is largely due to the fact that what is appropriate depends on the subject matter. Your experience with chemistry is one thing, your experience with dating is another. And in both cases, you may have some knowledge, but I hope you don't get your knowledge of dating by chemistry. It's a different field. And so knowledge is important. It is crucial to understand why we strive for knowledge, and that is because it allows us to have a basis that we can share with others. Generally speaking, knowledge is public. It is based on method that you can ask others to use and to follow to gain the knowledge. And if you don't have a way of others gaining the knowledge that you have, then that tends to call in doubt whether or not you have knowledge. But while there is no general criterion, in most areas of practice and thought and experience, there are criteria which allow you to know whether or not someone has knowledge. If you're teaching the poetry of Keats, for example, you can find out whether or not a student has knowledge in ways that are normal in that field. And that's true of every field. Now, here's the next move. Knowledge brings authority. And this is where the tie begins to bind. Knowledge brings authority. It tends to confer a right and responsibility to act, to direct action, to formulate and supervise implementation of policy, and to teach. If you're going to have the rights and responsibility that goes with these, you need to have knowledge and not just true belief. You need to be in a position to teach on the basis of your understanding of your subject matter that gives you a claim to knowledge. But now then, claims to knowledge are not the same as knowledge. And because knowledge is so influential in human life, people tend to claim knowledge they don't have. And claims to knowledge then become instruments of oppression. So now you can see how the first thing I said about what skepticism is good for begins to come into place. Because when you hear a claim to knowledge that you think is not justified, and you see people exercising authority on the basis of their claims to knowledge, that's where it is good to be skeptical. It is good to raise the question of the basis of the claims of the person who's doing the talking. So next slide, from knowledge, then we move to power. Authority institutionalized or vested in individuals tends to drift away from knowledge to power. Power to harm or hurt, to cause people to do things. There's a social connection with authority that begins to give one even sometimes the right to invoke governmental power, which is in many respects the ultimate kind of force that can be brought to bear. So authority institutionalized or vested in individuals tends to drift away from knowledge. Knowledge is stood in the area of freedom and truth and openness and inquiry. But when a person in power is put in a corner, they want to disregard that and just use the power. Thus it becomes oppressive, and it often opposes truth. Now that's a familiar story, isn't it, in human history? Authority opposing truth because it undercuts their power, and even opposed to knowledge. That's, of course, a familiar human story. Now, next slide. That's so harmful because there's something about human life that's extremely important about living with your own thoughts and your own understandings and choices. I think this goes very deep theologically as well as socially and just psychologically. We're meant to live by our own thoughts and our own convictions, our own insights and feelings. That isn't an easy project, but somehow if you take that away, you crush human life. So authority can blot out this extremely important thing about living from your own thoughts, understandings, and choices. And that's where skepticism comes in. So our next slide is skepticism. Historically and socially, a primary role of skepticism has been to break the grip of authority and power, social, institutional, sometimes even individually. So there's a great battle now that breaks out here between authority that may or may not be warranted by the knowledge that is claimed and the needs of individuals to live from their own convictions and insights and understandings. It's a question of integrity. The person who is put in a corner where they have to accept, at least outwardly, authority that is they don't believe in and they're not based upon legitimate knowledge claims, loses their integrity. Or they may have to even give their life to hold on to their integrity. So the first, next slide, the first aim that we want to think of with skepticism is liberation. Now, our history is full of familiar stories about this, and I want to save time just by mentioning, for example, Galileo and his struggle with authority, and the liberation that didn't make it to him, at least in his lifetime, but has come through him to many, many other people. And you could mention all kinds of cases, politically, artistic, and otherwise, where liberation has been the effect of skepticism that pulled the support from under illegitimate authority that was crushing the life out of people. The skeptic then becomes a kind of hero. And we see a lot of that in our Western history and in the present. Skepticism isn't heroic necessarily. It can be if it is used for a good purpose, but it need not be. So now, let me try to just briefly say what skepticism is. Skepticism is an attitude that calls claims to knowledge into doubt, calls it into doubt, and gives a working space for people who wish to keep the integrity of their beliefs, but also, as we'll see in a moment, wish to inquire further into the issue that may be coming up. Now, skepticism can be broader or narrower in scope, but the point is that we do not, or do not necessarily, have knowledge of a certain kind. We may think we do, There may be others who wish us to think we do, or at least to think they do, but that is what is in question. So skepticism is not doubt, though it may be involved in doubt. Skepticism is the question, is this really true? Is this really knowledge? And it goes into the details that may involve an elaborate system, like Galileo calling into question the geocentric system of the of our solar system. So that involved a lot of hard work, went on for centuries, and that's the nature of skepticism also. Now, let me give you two kinds of skepticism. The next screen is extreme skepticism. Extreme skepticism simply denies there's any knowledge. And you find cases of this in the history of philosophy. And skepticism has been treated at great length by scholars. Richard Popkin's book on the history of skepticism between Erasmus and Descartes is a good scholarly source if you're interested in it. Extreme skepticism simply denies that there's any knowledge at all. Extreme skepticism tends to be dogmatic. And the reason is because it cannot support itself on knowledge. It has just denied there is any such thing. And so it tends to be a kind of shrug, a kind of an intellectual that. Now, what makes it attractive is it does liberate you, but liberate you into what? And really, it cannot be sustained in ordinary life. There we are constantly distinguishing between what is known from what is not known. And we do that on a good basis. It simply is not true that there is no knowledge. Actually, knowledge is not rare, and it's not esoteric. It's very common. Your lives are filled with knowledge, and not just the kind you take a test on or write a paper on. Our ordinary life is guided mainly by knowledge. Many times by beliefs that we haven't tested, but we could test them. And if we did, we would find out that they were well-founded. And so I like to call attention to this form of skepticism and then set it aside in favor of what I call targeted skepticism. Targeted skepticism is aimed at a particular area of knowledge or at specific issues, for example, geocentrism. It's very interesting that targeted skepticism always depends upon some body or range of knowledge. That's what allowed Galileo to come to his view about the sun being the center of the solar system, was knowledge. And so targeted skepticism is bookended on both ends by knowledge. It runs from knowledge. If it didn't have knowledge, it would never come up. But on the other hand, it runs to knowledge. It seeks knowledge. Now, it's consistent with taking some areas to be outside of knowledge. And I mention here on the screen, today, morality and religion are often rejected, especially on campuses, as areas of knowledge. And especially in the 20th century, there emerged, both with reference to religion and to morality, something that we sometimes call non-cognitivism. Non-cognitivism, that is, thinking that religious claims cannot constitute knowledge. There's nothing cognitive about it. Emotional, important, yes, for human life, but not knowledge. And then that same view famously was adopted with reference to morality, the idea that when you utter a moral judgment of some kind, someone is a good person or a bad person, some action is right or wrong, it's just like cheering for what you call is good and booing what is you call is wrong, but there's no cognitive content to it. They're not true or false, evidence does not apply, and no one is right or wrong cognitively in those areas. But I see that's consistent still with targeted skepticism. And actually, it's consistent with targeting skepticism at religion and morality, as we will say a little bit more about this in just a moment. Targeted skepticism seeks evidence and is based upon evidence. So, next screen, targeted skepticism can be a path to inquiry. And usually it is for people who engage in this kind of work. Whatever the field may be, if they have doubts about some theory that is in the field, that may lead them to question the evidence the theory is based upon, and that in turn can lead them into inquiry that could provide knowledge of the subject matter. So now, I give you this idea of the responsible skeptic. The responsible skeptic seeks to discover and to know. That is their objective. Skepticism is for that person not the end and the aim. That's not what their life and their work is about. They're not trying to evade responsibility, they're trying to be responsible and to bring knowledge out of an area where there perhaps is none at the time. So now, next screen, just in summary, we have these two forms of skepticism. We can call it extreme or dogmatic skepticism. It doesn't lead anywhere. It's possibly some form of vacuous liberation, but that's all you get out of it. But it doesn't give you anything positive to live by. It's an evasive tactic. And very often, a young person will slip into this form of pervasive skepticism or extreme skepticism and experience it in a kind of romantic way that gives them a lot of psychological satisfaction and makes them appear to be a dashing fellow or girl in their companionship. Can we go into the next screen? But extreme skepticism shuts off serious inquiry into things that really matter, because there's no way forward on extreme skepticism. If you are targeted, you can find a basis for proceeding with your inquiries, and you can make some headway. But that's not true of extreme or dogmatic skepticism. It shuts off serious inquiry into matters that really matter. Targeted skepticism, on the other hand, would seem to be an intellectual duty. It would have virtue about it. And it arises from the need for truth in responsible living, for truth and knowledge in responsible living. Belief is not enough. It's nice if your beliefs are true, but we all want our beliefs to be based on knowledge, where that's possible. And that's the best possible basis for belief. Now, sometimes belief outruns knowledge and you have to go with what you got. But it's never preferable that way if you can base your beliefs upon knowledge. Institutions could, without becoming terribly crushing in their authority, help people come to the place where their beliefs are based upon knowledge. But institutions tend not to do that because they find inquiry threatening. And one of the worst things that happens for young people, especially who are raised in a particular political or religious context, is they're encouraged to think that to inquire is itself a kind of treason. Whereas the only hopeful thing for a young person is to inquire in such a way as to find out the extent to which their beliefs can be based upon knowledge. Okay, so that's the general lay of the land. Now, let me wind up here by talking a few minutes about what we should be skeptical about. And now I'm talking about targeted skepticism. What should we be skeptical about? Well, to begin with, not about things that everyone else is skeptical about. Skepticism has a way of creating its own social conformity. Targeted skepticism should be addressed to things that really matter, not trivial things, and to things assumed to be obvious. Now, I'm going to talk about things that are often assumed to be obvious where you and I live on a university or college campus. For example, it tends to be assumed that you are your brain. And many people will, even if they don't believe that, they will say that because that has become a part of what they think to be scientific orthodoxy. If I may say so, it isn't scientific at all, though often it tries to gather scientific languages and suggestions around it to fortify its authority. But that would be something to be skeptical about. Now, right away, when you say, well, what are we going to be thinking when we do that? That always comes up when you suggest something to be skeptical about. What about this one? Marriage should be based on romantic and sexual feelings. Well, probably many of you have or will make a decision about marriage based on romantic and sexual feelings. But is that actually a good basis for a marriage? And then the question comes up, well, what else? And that actually is a very fruitful question to ask because it will lead you into the question, well, what is marriage for? And it's very hard to get a good discussion of that because it's ordinarily assumed, well, we're turned on by one another. And of course, there's the problem that when it's turned off, then it's really off, right? And people will take that as a reason for getting unmarried. See? So these things have a lot of importance. Morality is just feelings. So no one has a right to tell someone else what they ought to do. That's very dear to the modern heart. But is that really true? Most of the past, it was assumed that you had an obligation to help people understand what was right and good. And of course, it was often abused and treated in a bad way. But still, there was a community, pretty well up into the 20th century, of people who helped others, young people especially, understand what was right and what was wrong and what was good and what was bad and what was virtuous and what was vicious. But that idea of it just being feelings kills that whole enterprise. It may be that something is gained, but I do think that much is lost. So just go on to the next slide, and what I'm saying here is, I repeat the previous slide, but at the bottom I have added, devote serious intellectual work to such issues. That's targeted skepticism. Targeted skepticism takes these issues that are so important and devotes serious intellectual work to them. Well, finally, let's talk about ultimate issues. And of course, the universities at one time that were devoted to veritas were concerned about ultimate issues more than anything else. And that wasn't all that long ago. In fact, if you were to go back to the origins of Pomona College and look at the talking and thinking of the people who founded it, you might be surprised the extent to which it is founded with concern for ultimate issues. It's true of USC. It's true of Stanford. Berkeley began as a Presbyterian college. I finished up at Wisconsin, and Bascom Hall is named after a president of many years who was a minister of the gospel. And it was very common for ministers to be presidents even of secular institutions. See, that is something that has changed. So let's go on, very familiar artifact next, John 3:16. John 3:16 is one of the most common things known in our culture. Used to be a guy he had something looked like an afro, but it was rainbow colored, and he'd always sit down in the end zone where when they kicked a field goal or something, he would be on the camera, and he would put up a sign that said John 3:16. That's all it said. So now, but think a moment about this. Look at what John 3:16 says. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son to it, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. See, now our problem is that something like that is so common, and familiarity, as we say, breeds contempt. Actually, familiarity first breeds non-familiarity, and then contempt is easy. Because when we're familiar with something, we tend to stop thinking about it. But now, this is a pretty big deal. This is a pretty big deal. And for most of the history of the universities and colleges, the older colleges, not the newer ones, you won't find this with Pitzer, for example, or UCLA. They're newer, and they are in a period where people build universities and colleges just for education, not because God so loved the world or theological truth. So we need to think about that. Why was that so important? Perhaps rewording it. I've reworded it on the next slide. God cared so much about humanity that he sent his unique Son among us so that whoever relied on him would not lead a futile and failing existence, but would have a quality of life that is like God's, eternal. Now, you can see why treating religion as non-cognitive turns out to be important, because it has assumptions that we can regard something like this as simply an expression of emotion, and you certainly don't want to build an intellectual institution like a university just around emotion. And so, over a period of time, theology and all that was built around it disappeared from the universities. So I want to leave you with just this fact to think about. The university system in its history was basically built around, in the Western world, was built around things like John 3:16. People actually believed it, and they thought that it was a part of knowledge for the most part. That's a fact. Now here's a question. What happened? How did that change come about? How did it come about that this was set aside, and instead of this kind of truth, secularism takes its place? I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying, how did it happen? Generally speaking, people don't know how it happened. Was it that someone somewhere found out that John 3:16 was false, or that it was not knowledge or something of that sort? Well, a lot of people have thought that, but if you were forced to trace it down and make it stick, it might be hard to do. And so this is where we need to be skeptical. We need to be skeptical about John 3:16. We need to make it a topic of inquiry. But we also need to be skeptical about secularism. See, one of the hardest things to do is to be skeptical about the things that are in most need of skepticism. And if anything could be done about that on the campuses, it would be a great renewal of intellectual life on the campuses. Now, you have to look at the consequences of rejecting religious truth from the domain of truth, of identifying it with feelings. Where does that leave you? What does secularism give you to live by? So you're secular, congratulations. What's next? And once we've got over the idea that we need to get away from religion, then we have to face the question of what we're going to live by. And that is where our skepticism needs to take hold. It needs to drive us to inquiry. And we need to go back to things that often look very familiar, but in fact really aren't, that we haven't thought about very much, on both sides of the question, secularism or God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, because these are so important for human life. Skepticism is vital in education, and we need to have a revival of it, targeted skepticism, to help us pursue the knowledge that we need to live by and not just to pass courses. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Right, so thank you so much. So I actually agree with almost everything Dallas has said. So, first, some things I agree with. So I agree that I agree with your characterization of what truth is. I agree on the importance of truth. You said about the bitterness of truth, and even with your characterization of knowledge, and especially the part about us not having yet figured out what the meaning of an appropriate basis is. That's the job of epistemologists to figure out, and I'm an epistemologist, and we haven't yet figured that out. So my bad. Working hard on it. But there is something that I do want to disagree with, or I think I want to disagree with. I'm just not quite sure about it. So you said that truth is in trouble socially and on campus, and you gave these specific examples of morality and religion are rejected as areas of knowledge, I think was the idea. So this sounded, so I've watched one of your talks on YouTube, and I've seen you make this kind of claim before, so it seemed to me that this was an empirical claim. It's a claim about what's going on campuses, right, and that we can investigate this claim empirically. So it would be nice if there were surveys of various professors, and asking, do they think truth is possible? Do we have knowledge, and so on. So I looked around and tried to find such surveys, and I didn't find very much. And I even emailed the author of the Oxford bibliography, actually on relativism, and asking if he knew of such a survey, and he didn't, unfortunately. But one survey that I was able to find was the Phil Papers survey. So Phil Papers is an online database of philosophy papers, and they have a lot of academic philosophers as their members. And so they did a survey of academic philosophers on their various views, and so here are some of the results. So when asked whether they embrace skepticism about the external world, so can we know that there's a podium here and so on, 82% said that they are non-skeptical realists about the external world. 82%. 71% think not only can we know stuff about the external world, but we can know stuff a priori. Not about the external world, maybe, but 71% they would think we have a priori knowledge. 87% categorize themselves as either atheists or theists. It's actually mostly atheists in that group. But 87%, so presumably this 87%, they either believe that God exists or believe that God doesn't exist, and they think that their belief is true and based on an appropriate source, and so I would guess they would categorize it as knowledge. 75% are scientific realists. And even when it comes to moral realism, 56% embrace moral realism. So it seems to me that academic philosophers, anyway, for large part, do think that we have knowledge. So maybe one question then that comes up is, why aren't we teaching this knowledge to our students?
Great.
And I think, so first of all, I think that in other areas, so in biology or physics, they clearly are teaching this knowledge. So you might ask, well, why aren't, say, we philosophers teaching it? Well, I think there are a couple reasons for this. One is that the sorts of topics that we teach on in a philosophy class tend to be questions that we consider open. right? We don't think we know the answers to those questions yet. So we're not teaching a particular view on it. And the second reason I think that we don't teach knowledge in philosophy classrooms is that, well, from my perspective anyway, I'm more interested in teaching students methods for acquiring knowledge. So I'm not just interested in teaching this particular piece of knowledge or that particular piece of knowledge, but I'm interested in teaching them the methods that they can then go on to use and to gain lots of knowledge for the rest of their lives. So I guess I would like to know sort of a little bit more about why you have this view of academia as being this place where knowledge and truth are under threat. And yeah, if you could just spell that a little bit more, that'd be great. Thanks.
Oh, don't run away.
I don't have to respond, do I?
Oh, no, you don't, certainly.
I'll be right there.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for all that hard work and getting up some facts. It is, to me, a remarkable, really contradiction that people believe, especially faculty people, believe in research. And they think research is absolutely central, and it will determine whether or not you make your career, the quality of your research. But your research will not be judged in terms of truth. It will be judged in terms of standards of method. And if you tried to judge it, I mean, you can disagree with me and I may be wrong, but if you tried to judge the work of a faculty person in terms of truth, I think people wouldn't have any idea what to do with it. I think this also affects what has happened to the PhD dissertation. Standardly, the PhD dissertation used to be required to be a contribution to knowledge. I'm sure many of you have heard that language. My impression is that is never required anymore. That in order to get your PhD, you have to outline a research program which is acceptable to your committee, and then all you have to do beyond that is to follow that research program and demonstrate your intelligence and your ability to handle that particular kind of research. And I want to say that I agree with the findings about realism and so on. And to me, this is a remarkable change that has happened in the last 25 years. People like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore and others seriously wondered about whether or not there was an external world and argued about it and back and forth. Wittgenstein had a way of putting an end to that. But still, on the campus generally, I do think it is true that professors and students are likely to avoid claims of truth in favor of good research. And I can understand that, but I think it misses the point of research. Because what is the point of research if it is not to arrive at knowledge and truth? And I'm afraid often the response is, the point is to prove that you're acceptable in your context, that you know how to do what people want done in your area of research. But that doesn't carry you very far in terms of these larger truths, what I referred to briefly as ultimate truths. One reason why they were thrown off of the campus, in a manner of speaking, is because they did not admit to research along standard lines that could be judged valuable or not by the in-house standards of the profession. So I do agree that there has been a remarkable change in philosophy. Scientific realism, for example, a very interesting case. Scientific realism is the view that what scientists talk about when they deal with fields of energy and atoms and so on are actually real and not just toys that you use to guide your work, instrumentalism as it used to be called. So there has been a great change, and I think there's a real hunger in the area of morality and religion. But one reason why I wanted to talk about this to you tonight was to try to encourage you to follow up and be serious, thinking about ultimate issues in terms of truth and knowledge. Thank you for your comment.
All right, I'm just going to say real quick, I'd like to ask the audience to defer to students and faculty when we're asking questions. So we'll start right here.
All right, can you hear me? Hi, my name is Cooper.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. You seem like a very nice guy. And
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
But I'm curious, what I'm supposed to get from this. I like the question before, agreed with all of your premises up to the end. When you put a quotation John 3:16 on the screen, asked us, why have we stopped discussing this? And so my question is, you're speaking to this group of people who deeply align themselves with the liberal arts philosophy. That's why we're all here, is because we agree with all of those earlier premises. But why is John 3:16 more important for us to discuss throughout our days than what we've already spent our day discussing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope I get the question right. John 3:16 is important because it sets the scene for a whole life. It has a track record, among which was the building of universities like Harvard, with its little shield of Veritas and so on. And it sets the background of university education generally, historically. Now then, that has disappeared from the area of knowledge. Perhaps you will agree with that, I don't know. But in any case, that's not treated as something to be dealt with seriously in the academic context. And so what I'm trying to get you to think about is why did that happen? And what could be done about it? And my reason is because John 3:16 is incredibly important, even if it's false, or if it's meaningless, and that we should devote serious attention to trying to determine whether or not it is true. Now, whether we believe it or not. It has become so common that people don't think about it, either for it or against it. And I think that was rooted in the fact that the people who were for it didn't think about it much. And because they didn't think about it, that allowed it to show up in the domain of what was gratuitous or not supported in any way. And the whole tradition that regarded it as fundamental knowledge of life was allowed to slip away without justification. And that's what I'm trying to challenge people to look into. How would one go about thinking of the truth or falsity, the knowledge or not of John 3:16? Well, actually, Jesus is a pretty public object, and you might start there, trying to make sense of him. Ask yourself the question, why is it that he has had the influence even up to today that he has? Why is that? Think deeply about that question. Don't just wave your hand and pass it off, negative or positive. Think deeply about it. Inquire into it. Be skeptical about it in the targeted sense that drives you to inquiry. There's got to be a reason. But now, for example, very few historians will touch that question. And partly I think it's because they think that if they did, they would be dead professionally. It's like people who are afraid to discuss evolution because they've seen people who wanted to discuss it dismissed and pushed aside and lose their career. Not because of views they took about evolution, but they just thought it would be a good idea to think about some of it, and perhaps not to accept all of it. See, what has happened is the academic world, the intellectual world, has become an immense field of authority. And that is the primary role of skepticism in such a situation, is to liberate people from the oppressive authority of claimed knowledge. So that's why I think it's so important.
Dr. Willard, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Many atheists will say that they would only believe in God if somehow he could appear magically to them or give them undeniable proof of his existence, such as if he were to write "made by God" in every single cell, for example, or write his name in the sky. Given the importance of skepticism, when do you think skepticism has or should reach its limit when it comes to belief in the existence of God?
Well, with reference to any issue, you have to decide what are illegitimate requirements and what are not. And if a person is allowed to simply stipulate that "made by God" is written on every molecule or something of that sort, I would have to say that is not a reasonable demand to be made. There are standard lines of thinking about the existence of God. They're not new anymore, and they deserve attention. And so I would say, if you have one sound argument for any conclusion, that shows that it's true. And if you're willing to know whether or not it's true and willing to follow the argument, then you should be able to come to a conclusion that expresses knowledge. But to lay out demands of various kinds and say what it has to meet my standard, I think is simply unrealistic in any field, including philosophy of religion. So what I would say is go for arguments that have been tested, examine them carefully. Don't allow yourself to be put off by simply saying, well, that's an old argument. Look at it. See if it's a sound argument, or to what extent it may be sound, and so on. That is the only approach I know. Now, if I have a person that I'm talking with whom I perceive to be sincere in wanting to know whether or not God exists, then I try to find out where their thinking is and move from there. Because you can't really help people if you can't begin where they are. And I'm opposed to taking a sort of high-handed approach that just simply says, now I'm going to lay it on you. Rather, you have to find out where people are and work with them there. Another question I will ask a person is, would you like for there to be a God, roughly of the sort that's represented by Jesus Christ? And many of them have never dealt with that question. But if you wouldn't like for there to be a God like that, you will not follow the evidence that might lead you there. You will come to a point where you will turn a corner and say, I can't go on because I don't want to go there. And knowledge is something that has to be sought. Truth is not easy. You have to want it and be willing to lay yourself out to get it. So I'm afraid that's not much of an answer to your question, but at least that's how I would approach it.
Thank you very much.
All right, I hate to stop you, but I'm going to use our text question system real quick. The question is, how would you respond to the Bible's idea of walking by faith and not by sight? Aren't Christians' decisions based on belief and not empiricism?
Yes, that's a really important question, and it has played a vital role in the situation that we're in today. The quotation from Paul that we walk by faith and not by sight is not we walk by faith and not by knowledge. It's sight. He's talking about sight, perception. And that's not the same thing as knowledge. Faith is not opposed to knowledge. Sometimes you have to walk without knowledge and walk by faith. But that's not the general rule for human life, and thank goodness it isn't. So what we should seek knowledge, and to a person who's seriously interested in it from the biblical point of view, I would just encourage them to get a concordance and look up the word know and knowledge and see what an important place that plays in the walk of the Christian. Knowledge is fundamental. In fact, eternal life is defined in John 17:3 as knowledge. It isn't faith. Faith is important, but it does not compete with knowledge. And indeed, we want our faith to be based on knowledge as much as possible.
Hello, my name is James Dambra. I'd like to thank you firstly. Your ideas about what is skepticism and what is truth and what is knowledge were really kind of refreshing and really
Thank you.
Open and accepting, and I really liked the idea
Thank
that
you.
you were going down. Near the end of your speech, you talked about how, excuse me, kind of nervous. You talked about how the institutions across the United States have been going away from this inquiry into religion, not necessarily asking questions about John 3:16 and its relative truth or untruth. I have kind of a twofold point to that. Firstly, how would you respond to the idea that skepticism has run its course in America and has decided that that isn't necessarily the most important thing we need to be doing in our educational institutions? And do you believe that a true rational inquiry in an educational institution can commence without religion?
I'm sorry, what was the last word?
Can rational inquiry commence without religion in educational institutions?
Really, these are tremendously important issues, and I guess I would respond to the second one first. Religion does not oppose rationality inherently. But on the other hand, it tends to institutionalize itself, and in that context can become quite irrational. And I think it's really the part of those who are religious and who believe in religion to deal with that and to insist upon having evidence for one's beliefs as far as one can. My fear is that the secular world will be taken over by irrationalism, precisely because it cannot give a rational basis for choosing good and evil and living a life that conforms to the highest of human ideals. And I do think that skepticism in one sense has sort of run its course, and I think that's very unfortunate because of the reasons that I've tried to give this evening. Targeted skepticism is in many ways the only hope of humanity. And now I got myself wrapped up in the second question. Could you remind me of the first one?
How would you respond to the idea that targeted skepticism itself has, through the different people who are utilizing it in educational institutions, decided that religion in educational institutions is no longer necessary for the foundation of education?
Right. I guess I would say, to be a little cute, I'm skeptical about it. Yeah.
I thought you would say that.
I'm sorry, I should have more character than that, but you let me down. I do think we need more skepticism, not less. But it needs to be well channeled and targeted, as I say. And it needs to be under logical control and not at the behest of social impulses. What we've seen of skepticism in the past has often been socially impelled, not logically impelled. And what we need to do as Christians is to recover the logical drive towards truth. that helps us respond to questions in religion and in other areas in ways that help those who want to understand and to know what to do about the issue involved. The existence of God, whether or not Jesus Christ came into the world from God and what he did and what he does today, all of those. See, I think that we need to apply exactly the same standards as we would apply to anything. And that our only hope is to do that. Now, of course, there's a role for the work of God and for inspiration and divine guidance and all of that. But I think it's easy to show that those do not replace the hard work of careful study and thought in dealing with these ultimate issues.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's an honor to be here. My name is William Dan. I'm from the graduate school, and I'm a student of political philosophy. And Luther, in his debates with Erasmus, argued that the Holy Ghost is not a skeptic. And in the book of Job, when he was being skeptical about his condition, God rebuked him by, "Who are you when I created the world?" So, as a human being, do we find limits of understanding within which we are only able to choose between a perpetual skeptical attitude and obedient faith, and perhaps not both? In other words, to what extent can we be skeptical and a good believer at the same time?
Well, actually, skepticism and belief are not contradictory. For example, we may well pursue skeptical thinking because we wish to know whether or not our beliefs are true. But you don't have to turn loose of your beliefs in order to examine the evidence for them. One of the situations that we need to deal with is the fact that often people get confused and they believe their doubts and doubt their beliefs. And at least every other day you might doubt your doubts and believe your beliefs. And that will give you a refreshing grasp on what you're dealing with, I think. So I don't think we should regard them as opposed, but rather as supplemental to one another. Now, of course, what I've called extreme skepticism is opposed to belief. Though if you're careful in the way you state it, you can say, well, we don't know anything, but of course we believe things. And then that has set some people free of looking for evidence for their beliefs because they say all you have is belief anyway. So it's like the question about faith and sight. We had to be careful of what is being opposed to what. And actually it is the believer often who invests the greatest effort to understand. Again, Galileo was a case in point. It was his beliefs that led him to engage in a life of research and writing and thought that enabled him to move from belief to knowledge. And I think that's a natural trajectory, and that's what I would encourage everyone who is a follower of Christ to do. I would encourage them to believe that if there was a better way, Jesus would be the first to tell you to take it. He's not going to stand around and say, well, you know, that's not Christian. He wants us to be people of truth, and he wants us to be people of knowledge. And that's what he promises us. He says, if you abide in my teachings, then you are my disciples, and you will know the truth. And that's where we should be living, I believe, as academics and as human beings. We should respect truth and do everything we can to gain it.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciated your talk.
My pleasure.
My name is Nadeem Faruqi. I go to Claremont McKenna College. I have a question regarding on the same vein that you were just talking about. Our utmost goal is to seek truth. Now, within academia and philosophy in particular, there are people with competing claims of utilitarian versus Kantian, people who believe within the religious realm that it's best to be Catholic versus being Protestant, etc. And this goes on and on.
Yes.
Now, in trying to seek truth, in trying to have truth as our utmost goal, what's the best way to resolve those conflicts? And my question basically is, if we're trying to strive for truth, and there are people with competing claims, both of which are very persuasive, what's the best way to resolve those differences?
Yes. I hope my answer will not be too disappointing to you, but I think that the answer is be sure and pay attention to the details and be willing to accept the truth that you don't already accept. So often in these kinds of controversies, people don't look at the details. They satisfy themselves by working with slogans of various kinds, and they're not really prepared to change. And that's where our integrity needs to grow. And we need to be willing to invest the work of looking into the details of the arguments. And if we do that and we're willing to learn, then we probably will change things that we thought we were not going to change. But again, I think that's simply the demand of integrity on the human soul. But the details are important.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you again, Dr. Willard, for coming. My name is Justin Sykes. I'm from Claremont McKenna College.
Pleased to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. In response to Professor Locke just a moment ago, you were talking about how research methods that you see in academia today don't necessarily correspond to being able to prove Christianity or being able to prove things like John 3:16, the ultimate truths that you talked about. So my question is, in regards to trying to seek out truth in that kind of matter, seek out ultimate truth, what kind of research methods and what sort of justification should we be looking for? Should we be looking at empirical grounds, or should we be looking at what happened?
Right. I think that you follow the lines of investigation you'd follow with reference to any kind of question. There isn't, I believe, a special kind of religious reasoning. Now, there is involved, as we would say, grace and the work of the Spirit of God and all of that. But as far as our work is concerned, empirical grounds, logical grounds are the two main bases that we want. And of course, they go together. They're not just opposed to one another. But for example, with reference to John 3:16, God so loved the world that he sent his unique Son. That's something that we should look into empirically. Did he? And what is the evidence that goes along with that? And that's where I believe that we can make some progress. But you cannot get many people to do that. They're not willing to look at it. And as a result, basically a partial result at least, we have lots of fields of practice and of learning that really aren't tied together. There's no overarching unity in them, and no way of getting that because people are content to work within a set of assumptions that are respectable within their trade, their group. So I would just say, long ago, an old English philosopher named Hobhouse said, all that religion requires of philosophy and science is a fair field and no quarter given. In other words, take your gloves off and go at it. But you can't remain at the level of generalizations and slogans. You have to really consider what facts are available to be considered. And then you have to be very careful to follow logic and don't cook up some new kind of logic that will suit your where you want things to come out. Logic gets messed with endlessly since Hegel, and it's really epidemic in the 20th century and continues in the 21st century. You just need to get a good introductory logic text and figure out what it's all about, and then use those principles along with what you can learn empirically and by authority, because most of what we know because someone told us. Well, we do know it. Like nearly all of us here know the multiplication tables. I doubt there's anyone here who's actually worked them out. But you do know them because you received them from a reliable source. So that's a source of knowledge. We always have to keep checking it. Good authority is always authority which allows itself to be questioned. But my general answer is use the standard ways of inquiring into anything. Be thorough and be fair, and keep talking to people and hoping that they will be thorough and fair also.
Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to say we only have time for 2 more questions, and I'm really sorry to the guy in the back, but I hope you're the first guy up here to ask me a question after we're done. But I got to give people a chance to get out of here. So go ahead.
I'm just going to hold it down here so I'm short. Hi, I'm
Hi.
Molly in Student Scripts.
Pleased to meet you.
Thank you for your talk. I want to kind of go back to the beginning of your talk. And you said something about how truth is kind of analogous to aiming at a target. And my first question is, I wanted you to clarify what exactly is that target that truth is aiming at. And my second question is, if we're trying to seek truth, why not at least begin with extreme skepticism and then move on?
Could you help me with the questions? I couldn't get the questions. I couldn't hear them.
Okay, should I repeat
You
it?
want to repeat the first one?
Yeah. So my first question is, I'm asking you to clarify the target that truth is aiming at. And my second question is, if we're seeking truth, why not start with extreme skepticism and then move on?
Start with what?
Extreme skepticism.
Well, you're welcome to start with extreme skepticism and carry it as far as you can. And I encourage anyone to do that. Extreme skepticism actually turns out to be a pretty complicated philosophical position. And you're going to be faced with the option of whether or not you're just going to accept it with a shrug and be thankful you're off the hook, or you're going to try to defend it. And I encourage people to do that. I think we should start there. Very good. Now, I'm sorry, if you could help me with the first question.
First question is, what is the target that truth is aiming at?
The target of truth, reality. The target of truth is reality. We're trying to come to terms with it.
Molly's one of my favorite students, so I want to make sure her question is...
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, my hearing just wasn't done.
So you mentioned this metaphor where truth aims at a target towards the beginning of the talk. And I think you just wanted to explain that, what he means by that metaphor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the human problem is to come to grips with reality. One way of defining reality is to say it's what you run into when you're wrong. Right? You don't want to run into it. And what truth allows you to do is to come happily to terms with reality. And that's why it's so important. So now, it is an unfortunate, perhaps, metaphor, but a rocket or something, if you aim it correctly, your aiming device is well set, then you hit your target. Of course, if it's not, you won't. But that's the way with false belief. False belief puts you where reality is not. And sometimes that's a very unpleasant place to be. I'm sorry, I had trouble hearing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, Doctor.
Hi.
My name is Anthony Jackson.
Pleased to
Call me
meet you.
AJ. I'm actually not a student of any of the colleges here. I'm a JC student over at Chaffey College. I am the president of the Christian Club over there, and the recommendation of one of my pastors, I won't, embarrass him by pointing him out, but he recommended I come here, and I found this very rewarding. I agreed with everything that you said, pretty much. I just wanted to actually highlight something and ask if you could give some greater definition. You said before that many of these things are things we should be skeptical of, and things the world is denied. That morality is just feelings. Now, I'm not a philosophy major. I'm actually a music major, trumpet performance. So forgive me if I don't understand all the lingo and if I confuse terms. But From what I've gained to understand is religion gives us a purpose in life or existence, and morals kind of act as an operating system, the best way to do this and to socially interact. Morals kind of I don't know if we confuse moral and ethics, but they act kind of as an operating system for our social structure. So my question, if you could kind of break this down for me, it's a little complex, but could you please define morality? What is it? What purpose does it serve in society? Could we live without it? And is there a way to make it more efficient? Is there a universal code of morality that functions as an optimal for humanity?
The answer to your question is yes. No, let me just try to say that the function of morality is to answer the question, how can I become a good person? Everyone wants that question answered, even if they don't believe morality is knowledge. And if you want to know how badly they want it, just attack their goodness and watch how they respond. But you want your bulletproof vest when you do that. Every person wishes to be a good person. A lot of confusion about what that is and so on. I don't deny that. But the problem of morality is to help people understand what that would be like and something about how they would get there. Now, from the beginning, the main problem has been, how can I do what I should do to be a good person when I don't want to do it? And how can I not do what will make me a bad person when I want to do it? The conflict between desire and good is the primary element in the development of systems of morality.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.